Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to first go over what the agenda is for today's call. So start with just a little bit more of an introduction about me and some of my background in addition to what Steve's told you. I'd like to then talk about some of the different foundation structures and staffing models that exist, talk about what technical assistance from a foundation can mean and look like, and how to access that as a fundraising professional, how to navigate the application process, and definitely what some of the ways are to improve your navigation of the system. We'll talk about what some of the top reasons are why proposals are denied, and then generally some tips that kind of don't fit into those other headings but are unique things to know from the foundation side that will improve your ability to be competitive in the funding process. Since everyone's muted, I'll be pausing every few slides to ask questions. So as Steve said, if you could please either type your questions into the chat section or jot them down so that when we do pause, we can have some good question and dialogue. As Steve said, I own my own consulting firm, Leonard Consulting, and worked with organizations of all sizes, but really work a lot with grassroots organizations to improve their grant writing capacity and increase that revenue section of their budget. I have experience as a program officer at a public statewide foundation, which was a fantastic experience to be able to give money away. And it's hard to understand when I say that that's an incredibly difficult job, because I think you'd all understand that there's always more requests than there are money to give. And so the burden of having to give the money was surprisingly stressful, and to be in that role was interesting. But then to switch to the other side of the table, to be asking for money with the nonprofits and building their capacity to improve how competitive they were in the process, that's really what I've been focusing on for the last 8 years. So one of the things I'd like to highlight is the variety of different funding organizations where grant funding can come from. There's lots of different places where people will call grants and contracts or just grants, and that means a little bit something different to a lot of different organizations. But the variety of funding can come from private foundations, public foundations, corporate, and then you've got your government funding through maybe grants.gov from HUD or Department of Education, your state-based funding, and then regional funding from maybe a city millage or an area on aging type funding source. So I was in the private and public section as a program officer. So a lot of the tips and tricks I'm sharing, though, come actually from my colleagues from all these categories. There were great opportunities as a funding professional to sit at the table, to have roundtable discussions, and to dialogue about best practices as a foundation staff person, or in the case of foundations where there are no staff, with foundation board members. So a lot of these tips and tricks apply to multiple funding sources in terms of their type, but then also not always universal. So please keep that in mind. So when we talk about an actual foundation, we're talking about a non-governmental nonprofit organization. It's going to have funds that are managed by its own trustees and directors. It will have been established to maintain or aid activities serving the common welfare, which means all sorts of different missions. There are probably as many missions that have been worded for foundations as there are foundations. It means that they are making grants primarily to other nonprofit organizations. Within that mix, you also have operating foundations, which meet these restrictions I just talked about in these definitions, but are also funding them their own operating of programs. There's also different giving timelines. There's not a requirement for what time of year and how many times a year grants are made, just that the restriction is that the money is given for charitable causes. So for each foundation, there's a variety of staffing models. There are many foundations that have no staff and have only board of directors to carry out their giving. But at the same time, then, there are the foundations that do have program staff. Sometimes there will be only an executive director, but as a foundation gets a little bit larger and is a little more open about its funding process, you'll normally see a program officer would be the common staff title that you would see. And a program officer's role is to assist the foundation in articulating and implementing their grant-making goals as defined by their board of directors. They're often referred to as generalists. They wear many hats. They have many different grant-making cycles that they're often taking care of. So while they have maybe an expertise in the mission of the organization, they become a generalist because they have to understand and support and advocate for many types of programs. So there's a wide range of experience and expertise in terms of budgeting knowledge, programmatic knowledge, evaluation, that sort of thing. So some of the major responsibilities that you'll also often hear a program officer taking care of would include researching program areas and specific projects, developing a request for proposals, managing the proposal review process, preparing the packets for board of directors in terms of what's being put up for considerations for a funding cycle. Program officers are also often responsible for tracking grant results, taking care of grant evaluations, midterm reports, final reports, talking about whether or not funding should be renewed if it's a multi-year grant. And one of the big things then that some program officers are able to do is to provide technical assistance to grantees. We'll talk about technical assistance and how to access that in a little more detail here shortly. So one of the key things as a previous program officer, one of the biggest things that I want to talk about is how important it is to research the foundation that you think you want to ask for money from. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, geez, I saw them in the paper, and I see that they just gave $5,000 to the charity down the road. They must want to fund us. We're in the same community. If that's the dialogue, there's a great deal of research that needs to happen beyond that. So some of the key things that you want to think about researching is whether or not the funder is committed to the same mission and programs that you are. And I'm not saying that they should be the same mission, but they should be missions that support each other. So if you have a foundation that's talking about their mission is to serve children and increase educational opportunities, and your program is focused on, say, senior citizens, unless there's a connection between trustees, those are two things that are very separate spectrums in terms of mission. But if you start to use a lot of the keywords in missions, as you read between the two of them and you can see how they can support each other, that's a great way to start a dialogue about how your program and your mission supports the same mission that they want to work towards. Another key point to always research is whether or not a foundation accepts unsolicited applications. There's numerous funding databases that you can have paid subscriptions to. Sometimes you can access them for free, but one of the key things that will often come out there as a search criteria is whether or not foundations accept unsolicited proposals. There's a number of foundations due to staffing size or lack of staff that don't accept unsolicited proposals, or they say we only take things that our trustees and our staff are already aware of. So it doesn't make sense for you or your staff to spend the time applying if they're not going to even consider your application. Other things to research is what the specific application format or document is that's required, and that also as well what the deadlines are for that. As a foundation staff person, one of the easiest things in terms of what happens in the revolving pile on your desk of applications is if it's not in the required form, it's out the door. If it misses a deadline, it's out the door. So regardless of the merit of the program, that's one, you're kicking yourself out of the program by not following their format. If there's a 5 p.m. deadline and you walk in to hand deliver at 5:15, 9 times out of the 10, the foundation will say no, and your work will have been for nothing at that point. You'll have to wait till the next application cycle. It's important to understand what these requirements are so that when you're spending your time, you're spending it well and increasing your chance of funding. So here's some other things to think about in terms of research. What are the grants that the funders made in recent years? What's the average size of their grants? Are they geographically spread out over the state? Are they specific to a region? Are they looking nationwide for where they're going to spend their money? Who are the foundation's board members? If you're looking at a foundation that's very local in its giving focus, it's important to know if maybe any of your board members know the foundation board members, and not that you're trying to bypass the system, but to get some more information and try and see if it's an appropriate fit. And then once you've kind of looked at some of these points of what are you trying to research, what are you trying to understand about the foundation, you might sit back and say, well, geez, how am I supposed to know this about a foundation? Where is all this? I don't necessarily want to pay a significant amount of money for an annual subscription to a database. So there's a few key things that you can do where you'd find information about most foundations. There are the databases that are paid subscriptions. You can do those. You can usually search for them. Like I said, so there's paid subscriptions with either maybe an annual fee, or some of them will have maybe a trial period or a monthly subscription so that you could log in and do some database research that way. Those databases are all based on IRS 990 filings. So you'll notice across the databases much commonality in terms of the information. It's just how easy it is to print or search. It's really the variability between those. But beyond that, I mean, those 990 filings can be extremely extensive. One of the things to look at then beyond that is more than the 990 form. Does the foundation have a website? Does the foundation produce an annual report or a newsletter? The pieces that they produce themselves beyond just their financials are where you're really going to be able to dig in and understand their message and the work that they're doing right now. So those are probably some of the key things. If a foundation's taking the time to put their information on a website or produce an annual newsletter, those are some of the key things that you want to pay attention to, and you would want to read those all extensively before you ever place your first phone call or email to a foundation so that you really understand who they are. One of the things foundation staff can tell is whether or not you researched them, or if you're kind of making a cold call with no background knowledge about who they are, what they do, or why they do it. So really research is a key point here.
Diane, do you have time to take a quick question?
I was going to go for one more slide and then have a question.
Go ahead. Okay, sure.
Thanks. I just was going to link the next two together. Sorry, I hate to be difficult. I just want to finish this one train of thought on it.
No, it's your show.
Thank you.
Go right ahead.
But so really the research is all around getting to know your funder. So I talked about why there's various levels of staffing, be they paid staff, there's directors, a whole variety of models for foundations. But it's important to try and contact the foundation to find out what they feel about your proposal, to see if they say, oh, geez, you're close, but what about this? Or, oh, I'm sorry, you're talking about the wrong geographic region. It's a really important dialogue to have that makes your proposal much more competitive, and it might save you all sorts of time. It's important if you're going to try and get to know your funder and do some research. So you've read your websites, you've read your annual reports, you're reaching out in person. It's important to listen to what they say, to actively listen and not have on, not wear your rose-colored glasses to say, oh, yeah, I think that they were behind us, but to really listen, because the foundation staff, they don't want you to spend the time on a proposal that has no chance of being funded. So while they might not come right out and say, no, we wouldn't fund it, they might say, well, maybe, or use lots of nice ways to try and give you some positive feedback or some constructive criticism about what might make you more competitive. It's important to really listen and not be pushy about your idea. Okay, so that's why it's important to follow those steps. Research and start to reach out. We'll talk some more about reaching out, but I do want to pause now for some questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Well, I'll unmute everybody in a moment. Miriam is asking, how do you receive an invitation to a foundation to which you would like to apply if they do not take unsolicited proposals? And if you'll bear with me just a minute, I'm going to unmute everybody, so if we want to have a discussion, we can. Here we go.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay, we're all unmuted. All yours.
Thanks. So, Miriam,
Sure.
that's a great question because there's so many foundations that if you were to do a search, that would come up as not accepting unsolicited proposals. For the most part, the easy answer is you probably won't receive an invitation. If you were to spend if you only have an X amount of time per week or per month to spend on grant funding and seeking grant funding, that would be probably the last thing on the bottom of your to-do list in terms of trying to seek out an invitation to an unsolicited proposal. There are exceptions to that, and really, if you do find one where you're like, oh, we are so perfect, we've got to get in with that staff and that board and find out what's happening. If you really do find one that you feel that strongly about, my recommendation on how to do it is to start first to see if their board and your board have any overlap or any knowledge, relationships, anything, because often an unsolicited proposal restriction like that on a foundation, the way into that is to have a trustee kind of champion your cause and say, I have this great new cause that I think meets our mission, and to use that as your way in the door. And I guess I'd like to open it up to say, does anyone else have experience trying to reach out to a foundation like that? Have you had success? What would be your suggestions? And everyone's unmuted, so you can jump in at any time.
Okay, we have another question. Did you want to take that one next, or do you want to?
Sure. No, we'll keep going. Miriam, if you have more questions about that, do let me know.
Miriam, was that? Do you have a follow-on question, or are you okay with the response so far?
That definitely answers my question. I just need to dig deep and find out who the board members are and just not agree.
We're having a little trouble hearing you.
Hear me now?
Are you on speaker?
I am.
Okay. Any chance I get you to pick up?
Can you hear me?
Yes, a little better. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, I was just saying that I just need to, I'll just have to, present some board lists to my board and see if anyone knows anybody and do it that way, which sounds, it's all about relationships, so that makes perfect sense.
Yep, and don't be discouraged if it doesn't pan out. If you, as an organization, start to be a little more public about some of the things, and you never know that there might be a way that they'll come to you, but short of the trustee connection route, that really is usually the best in terms of seeing if there's even an avenue.
Okay.
But sometimes it's hard to get onto those foundations that are closed. A lot of the times they're called list foundations because once you're on the list, you're golden. But it's awfully hard to get on those lists sometimes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And Miriam, we're getting a little noise from your line. I'm just going to mute you for a moment so we can take the next question. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, maybe that wasn't coming from Miriam. We unmute her. Well, we have another question from Doug. He's asking, could you define public funding sources again? I thought public was synonymous with government.
That's a great question, Doug. When I talk about public, I'm talking about a public foundation. So you're right. Normally, if you're talking about just public money, that would be a government contract or grant through HUD, Department of Education, HHS. There's a whole variety of funding organizations. But a public foundation is one, like a community foundation, where the funds come from public sources and then are granted following normal foundation protocol with boards of directors. And so that really is the difference in what stands out from a public foundation versus a private foundation.
So what are some examples of the public funding sources for a public foundation?
So a community foundation is a great source. That's a great example of them. That's the most common. Most other foundations would fit into the private category. Sometimes you will find statewide foundations that are public because they are supported not through private donations, but rather through donations from citizens.
Okay.
But normally, so like the Community Foundation of Northern New York, that's the one that's in my backyard, that would be a public foundation.
I see.
It's supported by donations from residents of the surrounding counties.
Okay.
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 Okay. Does anybody else have any questions before we jump back in? Okay, well, I'm glad to see questions, and I'm really pleased to see them being entered into the chat box as well, because then we can take them as soon as we get a break. So that's helpful too. All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody, and then bring our instructor back up here.
You might try muting me if I don't have a question. You might try muting me. I'm on a portable. It might be me. So
you're the guilty party, huh?
It could be, yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. No problem. No problem.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, Diane, you're back in.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
So as we talk more about foundation research and understanding the staff, really the goal of trying to talk to the foundations and understanding them, what you're trying to get to is whether or not they're willing to offer you any technical assistance. And technical assistance can be provided in a whole variety of ways, be it informal or one of these more formal sources I have listed here. You'll notice that I think you'll have seen the same trends that I do, that a lot of the funding sources, even if they're governmental, separate from, if we're talking just about foundation grants here, are starting to offer really online technical assistance. Instead of trying to host an RFP workshop in person where everyone has to be there, there's a lot of conference calls that are happening. There's a lot of webinars that are being utilized through the various conference systems, and it's a great way to be able to get some information about the request for proposals that's been released and have questions answered and hear your colleagues' questions as well. Often that'll kind of trigger some more questions. And then the other beauty of that is that so many of these are now being made available as a recorded session after the fact. So that's a really nice technical assistance piece that foundations are starting to provide more often on a formal basis. If a foundation isn't going to offer such a formal level of technical assistance, some of the other things then that you're trying to find out through your research and reaching out to these program officer staff folks is whether or not they'll accept written questions. If they'll accept written questions, is there a time period in which they will only accept those questions? A lot of foundations will cut off questions 2, 3, 4 weeks before a deadline, depending on their timeline. The next one is really, so now we're getting deeper into like personal technical assistance here. So if you've reached out to a program officer on the phone and you've been able to have a conversation with them about your proposal, about what you're trying to do, you've received some feedback from them, they have generously provided you with one-on-one technical assistance about your proposal. And that really is the goal in terms of, it's great to have all the information from the foundation at like a conference call level, but to have the personal feedback can really help you tweak your proposal just enough to say, oh, I get that point. Yeah, I can see why they asked for some additional clarification on evaluation, or, geez, they asked us why we weren't partnering with this community organization down the street, and, well, here's why we don't, or here's why we, maybe we should talk about it. To be able to address those questions in proposals, the benefit of it is that the program officer is typically asking you the questions that the board of directors or the grant-making committee prior to the board of directors approval is going to be asking the program officer staff. They know the players in their organization, and so if you can reach to them on that one-on-one level and get to ask some questions and have them ask you questions, those are the key things that you should be paying attention to and making sure to address. If you can get technical assistance provided on that level and you choose to ignore what they say or to not address it, they're not going to take it personally, like, oh, my feelings are hurt, but they're going to say, gee, I wonder why they chose not to listen to us. They must think that they either know better but it will raise questions, and it could end up changing your level of competitiveness in a process, to be honest, because it is about, they want to know that you are flexible and that you're to the same mission, but even if you say, we don't agree with what you asked us to do or what you asked us about, if you need to at least address that then in your proposal or your application materials so they understand that you were actively listening to them. every once in a while, they'll come across the foundation that will actually do proposal review prior to submission. Those are the real gems. They're hard to find. It's not always very public that they will do such a deep level in terms of overview. And it's not going to be like they're doing Microsoft Word track changes, like that level of review. But that they're going to, if they're willing to give you some feedback on, you know, we're going to ask for some more information about evaluation, or your goals and your objectives don't seem very measurable to us. Could you address that? If you can get that sort of feedback, I'm not joking. Like, those are the gem. Rare, very, very rare, like the diamond in the rough, but great to find. And the only way you're normally going to know about that is if you followed these ideas of researching the foundation, reaching out to the staff, and having a dialogue. It might get you to this point where all of a sudden now you get to have a proposal reviewed or have a longer conversation and have that back and forth dialogue. The program officer could end up being your biggest champion in that grant-making discussion and vote with the board or the grant-making committee. So you want to make sure that that advocate clearly understands what's happening with you and that you've listened to what they've told you. So one of the things that I discourage often for clients is using buzzwords. But at the same time, these foundation funding trends, I mean, these are all buzzwords that you see everywhere. Collaboration, mergers, evaluation, impact, and effectiveness, they're everywhere in terms of priorities, objectives that foundations have for their funding below the level of like what their specific mission is. So there's some key things to think about for how you address these different trends and whether or not you choose to include them in your proposal or your program design or not. One of the things to think about is how transparent it can be to a foundation or a proposal reviewer, be it the program officer or a board of directors. If you start to use the buzzwords, but it's not really true to its intent in your design of the program, they can usually see right through that. So it's important to understand if the foundation says, we really want to go for collaboration. I'm going to use United Way as an example, even though that doesn't fit the foundation model, but just as one of the most common nationwide trends that's pushing for collaboration and mergers to increase like the impact of their dollars. Their funding's been dropping. They want to see their dollars go farther, so they're encouraging mergers and collaboration. Well, they're going to be able to tell the difference between cooperation and true collaboration just by reading. Even without talking to you, they'll be able to tell. And so you just want to take that nugget and think through it as you're writing to whether or not it's true to the mission and the work that you're actually doing before you start to include these. Collaboration versus cooperation is one of the biggest ones that get mixed up in terms of terminology, that it's easy for staff to see through. And if they're asking for collaboration and you're not providing that in your program, the rest of your scoring probably won't be strong enough to keep you in the process. And I don't see these trends changing. I think that's the other thing. I mean, as assets have fluctuated with foundations, having had to do the same in a community, if not more, while assets were at a lower level, I don't think foundations are going to change because they've seen what changes can happen in the community and the way that nonprofits can change the way they do business by collaborating together, by having some mergers. Now that those impacts are becoming evident, I don't think these trends are going away at all. So something that you want to keep in mind. I'm going to talk about evaluation here for a minute before we pause for more questions. So evaluation is one of the buzzwords. It's been quite a long trend in terms of asking for more than output numbers. So a foundation might not necessarily require a logic model or a very formal evaluation plan. They might only ask for, a few paragraphs about evaluation. But evaluation is key in the sense that they're looking for effectiveness and impact. And if what they're getting in a proposal only talks about client satisfaction, as important as that is to the general design in your organization and being a thriving program and organization in the community, that's not going to cut it with a foundation that's expressed that it's into evaluation, that that's part of their decision-making process and it's important to them for grantees to work on. So again, you want to think about, as you read it, okay, are my goals and my objectives measurable? That's one good start. But in my evaluation plan, am I talking about more than output? Am I talking about bigger picture things? Am I talking about outcome-based evaluation? Maybe I'm fortunate enough to have an evaluator on staff. I mean, then problem solved. Your evaluation section will usually be great. But most nonprofits don't have that capacity. So while you're not expected to be an expert in an evaluation, they do expect that, again, it's more than output. And I know I'm repeating myself, but it's because it's so important. Your evaluation sections are starting to be scored higher if you look at foundation proposal breakdowns. And so it's in your best interest to shore that section up, to really make it stronger so that you're not leaving points on the table that you really could have used in order to be more competitive. So one of the things that gets talked about with evaluation is some of the barriers that I've had clients talk to me about. So if you're at the application stage and you've got a nice evaluation section written and you've talked about more than outputs and you've talked about some outcome-based things and you've got a good plan in place, one of the fears that nonprofits will often express is, well, what happens if it doesn't go the way I planned? Am I going to lose my funding? That's going to look horrible for us. So in an application, they might almost under-promise so that they can over-deliver, because the fear of not getting the results they want is too strong. So there's two pieces to that in terms of what a foundation is looking for. This is definitely not a case where you want to under-promise, over-deliver, because the organization down the road, well, they're promising what they think they can deliver, and they're going to deliver it, or they're going to. But you don't want to under-promise what you're going to do, just because you're worried about evaluation. Instead, what you might want to consider is to say, listen, here's our evaluation plan. If we realize that we're falling short mid-program year, because you're acknowledging that you're not going to wait till the end of the year to focus on evaluation, how are you going to fix it? And acknowledging that you might need to fix it in your work plan and where that fits in your timeline is one of the biggest things that, well, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about it more than the 4 weeks before the report is due. They're actually thinking about it at the 4-month mark and the 8-month mark and tracking the evaluation as they go. Even then, if you still said, okay, we're going to try and fix it and whatever, and you still fell short of your evaluation goals, the foundation's not going to pull funding just because you didn't meet your evaluation goals, especially if you can say, now as we look back, here's what happened, and here in the future is what we're going to do to fix it. Maybe you made a wrong assumption about the community. Maybe there was a significant change in terms of other services offered in the organization, in the community, so it changed what happened internally for you. Lots of things can happen, but if you can not explain away, but rather provide what the lessons learned were and how you're going to take that and move forward, foundations really respect that, and that actually in the long run can help you build a relationship and potentially get funding again in the future. It's one of the easiest things when I would get reports, and talked with colleagues about this all the time. Report time would come due and the reports would roll in, and you would get definitely a few that sound like they were canned reports, sort of like a rubber stamp. Here's our evaluation report. Things were great. Well, that's a great message to have, but everyone also does, we all live in the real world together. We're like, really? Things were just great. You want to be as honest in your report as you can, because if they feel like you're holding back or just giving a rubber stamp type evaluation or report to them, it's not necessarily a relationship that they want to continue to nurture with funding in the future. So just some things to kind of gnaw on and think about for how even your reporting and your application portion in terms of evaluation narrative can tie together, and what the message is that you're sending to that foundation staff. Okay, and then I'm going to pause for a moment, take a breath, and let Steve open it up for questions, if you could, please.
Okay, will do.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay, we are now unmuted.
So I guess I'd like to generally open it up if there's any questions about what we've talked about.
Okay. Or discussions, right? You're doing such an amazing job that all questions have been answered.
I'd like to believe that, but there's always questions.
Could you say once more, this is Doug, the difference between collaboration and cooperation? I thought those, again, were synonyms.
And that's a tricky line. So these aren't maybe the Webster definitions, but in terms of nonprofit definitions and what your foundations would be looking for, collaboration is true partnership.
Hang on just a minute. I'm going to mute everyone again just for a moment, and because I'm not going to be able to hear you. I don't think anyone else can, so give me 1 second here. I'm sorry.
The conference has been muted.
Okay, if you could possibly repeat the question, I just want to make sure everybody can hear what the question was, and then dive in.
Yep.
Thank you.
So the question that Doug asked was to distinguish again between collaboration and cooperation. And what I was starting to say was that, this isn't the Webster definition for sure. I'm like, can't quote those off, but rather this is, if you're talking to a foundation or a funder about what these two mean, they're definitely not synonyms. Cooperation would be more, and I'd like to just give programmatic examples of some of the ways to think about it. So if you're sharing some resources, you both run after-school programs, you're on opposite sides of town, and you need some equipment, so you they lend you some equipment, they need some equipment, you lend them some equipment. That's more of a light cooperation agreement. Now, if instead we were talking about collaboration, well, now, so 2 after-school programs, opposite sides of town, resources are shrinking. Maybe the collaboration is that in order to save staff resources, now you offer the program on Monday on one side of town, on Tuesday on the other side of town, and you go back and forth. So each organization is still hosting, still running their own program, but the other one is bringing their students to the other program. So you're effectively still providing the same services you wanted to in a different way, in a more efficient way, not going to the merger stage where you're merging your organizations, but where you're looking at your resources in a more shared way.
Sure.
Does that work, Doug?
Okay, let me bring that back up.
Sorry, still muted, sorry.
Doug, I think I unmuted you. I'm not sure. Maybe not. Hold on a minute.
The conference has been unmuted.
Yeah, that works. That works.
Does that help? Okay.
Yeah.
It is. It's a very tricky thing, and some collaborations can be stronger. There's lots of collaborative proposals now that you'll start to see where they'll even have forms set up such that you can have the main applicant as the fiscal agency, and then list down your 8 collaborative partners. But normally, if a foundation or funding source is talking about collaboration on that level, the expectation is that it's almost to the level of support and working together that there would be a memorandum of understanding.
Okay.
So you can kind of use that as a little bit of a litmus test for yourself to say, are we cooperating or are we collaborating? Are we doing enough together that we should really formally outline who's doing what and what their roles and responsibilities and fiscal back and forth is? Or is it on such a level where we're probably just going to write each other a letter of support because we're being nice and sharing resources type thing?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions before we dive back in? Okay. If you think of something, jot it down or type it in the interface while we're talking here. So I'm going to put everybody on mute and bring our instructor back. 1 second.
The conference has been muted.
There you go, Diane.
All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So one of the new things that definitely has come up in the last, I don't know, I would feel like it's getting much stronger each year to the point where maybe I'd say 35 to 45% of the proposals that I've worked on in the last year have gone through online submission. And so it's becoming a much bigger trend, and in some ways it makes your job as the applicant easier, and in some ways it makes your job harder. And it's definitely, so again, huge trend. Some of the foundations that have gone to it love it because it changes the way that they do business and how they process things. Some foundations may never go to it because it takes a different level of staffing to be able to provide technical assistance, and so there's just a whole bunch of reasons why some foundations may or may not. But it brings up an interesting point. I actually just was interviewed for an article about this, so I've been thinking about this a great deal, and there's some real things that it does to you as an applicant in terms of how you're viewed by a foundation. So one of the things it does is that it takes away your ability to provide, like I call them bells and whistles. You'll see applications a lot of the times that have bolding everywhere, it's underlined everywhere, there's highlighting, they're like trying to scream, we're over here, look at all this great stuff. And so you almost get caught up into some of those formatting things instead of what the narrative actually says, what the language is telling you, the word choice, and how succinct they can be in their description. And so the reason I want to talk about it on both sides is because if you started to move to more where you're seeing these foundations you have to apply to online, it really forces you to think about how you're describing your program and how in perhaps 750 characters you're going to describe your entire evaluation plan. I mean, the word limits and character limits on some of these things are frankly crazy sometimes, either on the too small or too large end. But it really forces you to think about what you want to say. On the flip side then, if you've started to do online applications and understand that character limit and what foundations are allowing you for space to think about your answer, you should take those lessons and put them to your paper applications. Because in the long run, it could improve your paper applications as well. Because what it shows you is that you don't need bells and whistles to have a really well-written, fundable proposal. If you've thought through your narrative, you've thought through your language choice, and you've answered their questions. The online system forces you to kind of leave a lot of the extraneous stuff that gets put in out because it's not a specific question and there just are not enough characters left at the end of the day to include it. And again, so more bells and whistles. Foundations have very strict language about, or many of them do, I should say, about what's allowed to be included in a proposal. You might say, well, they're not allowing the thing that I want to include. I have this great piece about the program, and I really want to include this newsletter article. Well, there's a reason that they're not allowing that, and often it's because of application volume. There just isn't enough room in their office and their file cabinets to accept that from everyone based on how many applications they get. But it's also about what actually is manageable in terms of reading for the program and providing a board of directors in terms of their decision-making process. So every once in a while, though, you do still see foundations that are kind of ambiguous about what they will or won't accept in terms of an application. They might say no formal whatever required, no formal application cover sheet. It's kind of like a free-for-all. So you're like, well, I think I'll do a 2-page letter of inquiry maybe, or maybe I'll do a 4-page narrative with a cover letter. And it's really up to you. So you get to decide how succinct you want to try and be or how, verbose at the other hand. Well, and I say that jokingly because I love to be verbose. And so character limits are definitely one of my favorite things to kind of keep me in check. But what really happens is in terms of bells and whistles, if you find a foundation that is not restrictive in terms of how many different pieces of paper they'll let you submit, you still want to stick to what those more common foundations are accepting. Maybe an organization budget is okay. Your 501c3 letter is a very common one to stick in there. Project budget. And I wish I could have a reaction from an unmuted line. But you don't want to send scented lotion. Or you don't want to send VHS videotapes. You don't want to deliver them with flowers. And I say these because these are true stories. And I'm not saying it in a mocking way to colleagues at all. But you don't want to go beyond what they're going to do, because then what you've become is this: you stick out in the program officer or the office managers or the board of directors, then you're sticking out in a bad way. And so bells and whistles in paper submission are the last thing you ever want to do in terms of trying to increase your competitiveness. Let your language, let your work, let your budget speak for itself. And the same thing then goes for online, but there it's being kind of forced on you because you're working within their restrictive system. So moving on to talk about, okay, so you've gone through all this. You've researched, you've talked to the foundation, you've included no bells and whistles, so everybody with the foundation staff is happy. Now it's pending. What do you do now? So there are some acceptable ways to continue the momentum in the relationship if one was established with the foundation beforehand. So it's a big if. If you were able to reach out to foundation staff during the application process, you can do a few different things to follow up while your application is pending. And you don't want to be pushy. You don't want to talk to them all the time. You want to use this in a very limited capacity, but there are some cases where it's appropriate to call the staff, verify that they received your information. If it's an unclear application process, you could ask what the status is of an application. But on the flip side, if they have a very clear application timeline for application, when they're due, when they make notification, when funding starts, that's not the time to call and find out. But if it's an ambiguous process, you can down the line, after giving 6-8 weeks at least, you could call and ask about the status. If you weren't able to really make contact, or if after the fact you could make contact during application but not while things are pending, another thing to do is you can do, if there's something key that changes, you can provide a written communication about that. So if the program that you've applied for funding for receives a significant award, or there's a significant change in the program design because now you've merged with another organization, or there's a fabulous new collaboration, something that's really going to change either in a positive or maybe in a negative way. If there's something that's a game changer in terms of what you've applied for, so your work plan is going to be very different, your budget might be different, it's a great idea to write a letter to the foundation, or in some cases you might just have email, but either way, but to reach out and explain to them what's changed and give them the chance to react and or just to take that in as part of their application. The other thing to do when your application is pending is, if you had a contact and a relationship with a program officer during the application process, you could ask if they consider site visits during an application process. Most will probably say no, because those that do allow site visits are normally, it's a very formal process for at which point they come out, how they decide how many people are going, and the whole thing. But it's something that you can talk about, especially if there was a relationship. Or you might just ask earlier on before you submit, geez, does the foundation conduct site visits as part of the application process? If you have the opportunity to get foundation staff or board or grant-making committee members to your site to see the program in action, it puts definitely that personal touch on it. It's not that it necessarily makes the choice, but often foundations will see maybe they'll conduct twice as many site visits as they will provide actual grants. So it's not necessarily the deal maker, but it definitely is a great way to let them see more about who you are and to articulate it in a slightly different and very personal way. So then what to do if the grant is funded? I always joke that when the grant is funded, I do cartwheels up and down the hall, around the office, whatever happens. I mean, like, there's hollering, there's yelling. It can be $500. It can be $1 million. Doesn't matter. I always react the same way. So once you've got all the celebrating part done, then the real question is, okay, if it's funded, now what do I do? Because it's not like you can breathe a sigh of relief and let it go. Even if you're the fundraising professional at the nonprofit and you have nothing to do with program implementation, there still is a lot of work that needs to be done by the funding professional in collaboration with the program professionals at the organization. So there's some really key things to think about. First and foremost, send a thank you letter right away. There should be a formal one that comes from your executive director on letterhead, separate from if you're required to sign a grant contract. In addition to that signature, there should also be a cover letter that goes with it expressing your gratitude for the funding, etc. If you, in the earlier stages here, again, like we talked about, were able to reach a program officer or a different foundation staff, maybe a trustee, if you were able to make some one-on-one contact with the foundation professional and you were awarded the funding, then you, as the person that had the contact, should reach out to them with a written note to say, thanks again, so excited, but to let them know how grateful you are that they spent the time with you, to give you the technical assistance, to give you some advice, and look at the great results that happened. Then comes the fun part, because you have to worry about, do they do renewals? What is their reporting requirement? Do they have restrictions in terms of moving budget funds across budget expense lines? Is there a 10% cap on, okay, so we're going to underspend on salaries, but only by 10% of total budget, so now can I move that to office supplies without having to ask? Or do you have to ask to reallocate even $1? To understand those restrictions, to understand whether or not a foundation has recognition requirements, that's one of the biggest things that used to happen, which might seem trivial, but if a foundation provides money and they require that you send out a press release or they require that on the materials provided with their support, you always say, funded in part by, and then the foundation name, and you as the organization don't meet those requirements, all you're doing is hurting yourself in terms of asking them for funding in the future, and even worse, you're hurting yourself with other foundations within that same community. Because you might hope that it doesn't happen, but foundations talk, and foundation staff talk, and foundation boards talk. And so if a grant is funded and the implementation goes awry in terms of meeting reporting deadlines, moving money for budgets without asking when required, not recognizing funders the way that they're supposed to be, the staff will talk about that, and your nonprofit will gain a reputation for being difficult to work with in terms of funding. And that's the last thing that anybody would ever want. So it's really important to understand, both as a fundraising professional and that your program staff also understand that sometimes when the grant is funded, that's when the majority of the work starts. And it can feel like more work to handle and manage a funded grant than the application process itself. So, with that being said, if I could pause for questions and discussion for a minute, please.
The conference has been unmuted.
Thank you. We're unmuted now. I guess I wanted to open it up and see if anyone wanted to talk about, really in particular, what happens once a grant is funded and some of the ways that you've worked to maintain a relationship with a foundation after receiving an award. And we have a personal experience that really was, be it a good or a bad experience in terms of the grant funding and how you handled that.
I don't want to talk about it because somebody might it might get around.
Well, you could use anonymous things. I can provide an example myself if we'd like instead. Worked with a client that had received funding from a community foundation, and things weren't going well. There had been staff turnover. They were so far behind in their timelines, and the reporting deadline had just passed. So it just wasn't going the way it had been planned. But no one had communicated that to the foundation until it was too late. And so after this reporting requirement has gone past, we sat down and said, okay, now it's time to actually talk to the staff again. And so by helping the nonprofit program staff reach out to the foundation and sit down and explain, here's why it's different. We didn't anticipate staff turnover. That really threw us for a loop. We lost our main program. All this happened. And at the same time, geez, we still think we can meet the goals and objectives, but could you give us an extension? Just by opening that dialogue, we're back on track. The client received a 6-month extension for the funding. They put their plan back in place for how they were going to continue to implement their program, just on now a new timeline. And in the long run, they've received 2 more grants from that same foundation because they realized they had a problem and a mistake in terms of grant management and implementation, but were open with the foundation about it and met the rest of the requirements that they set out for them. So, yeah, I don't want to call anybody out. I don't want you to be like, oh, the foundation's going to hear what happened, especially because we're recording today. I didn't mean it like that. So, but are there any other questions then about online versus paper submission, some of the different ways that's helping you, hindering you, tying your hands as an application, anything like that?
So are you saying getting rid of all? Are you saying get rid of all those bolds and underlines and the text formatting like that?
No. Sorry, let me clarify. That's a good question. Thank you. I'm not advocating that you get rid of them completely. What I'm saying is think about using them sparingly.
Right.
If your whole narrative is filled with underlining and italics and bullets, you probably want to pare it down a bit. So maybe 1 or 2 bulleted lists in a 4 or 5 page narrative. Maybe you bold the project title at the beginning in the paragraph, but not every time all the way through. Just to be conscious about what it looks like. So it needs to be easy to read, and that's why we, as writers, that's why we use a lot of the bullets. That's why maybe a chart is very appropriate sometimes, like a goals and objectives timeline type chart. I love those. There's nothing wrong with using those sparingly, but to think about what's excessive versus what's helping the reader understand your language.
Right. Okay.
Okay? Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we can continue then.
The conference has been muted.
Great. So now I'd like to share with you, this is like an accumulated list based on my colleagues on the foundation side. What are the main reasons for rejection? So the first one, the application, it just doesn't meet the funder's priorities. The foundation can tell, right away you read it and you're like, oh, well, we serve women and girls, and this is talking about serving chimpanzees. Of course, I'm exaggerating for just the sake of emphasis here, but if it doesn't meet their priorities, if it's not even close, it's out the door. So you want to make sure, again, your mission matches their mission as close as possible so that you know what you're doing is not wasting your time and is also not wasting the foundation's time. Programs not located in a geographic area of funding. It might sound like a simple thing, but if a foundation is located in, all right, we use nice home base here. If we're talking about it's located in New York and they say we only fund in New York City, and as an upstate New York organization, I apply to the foundation that says they only fund things in New York City. Well, there's no chance. Why? You should listen to what their restrictions are and not say, well, but I think they might make an exception because we're so great. If that was the case, they wouldn't have the restriction anymore and they would just be funding everywhere. So you really want to pay attention to whether it's city-based geographical restriction, regional-based, county line-based, statewide. There's a reason why they have those restrictions. It might be based in something that you don't agree with, such as where the trustees all live now. So maybe one lives one county over from you, but they won't fund in yours. There's all sorts of reasons why they have those restrictions. So your job isn't to try and change their mind. Your job is to listen to their restrictions and only apply if you meet them. Third one we talked about earlier. So not following the required format, that's a huge no-no. It's an easy one to not have be an issue for you. When there's a common application format required by a funder, and they say, please type in this form, or acceptable to recreate in Word, you better make sure that it looks very close if you're choosing to recreate. If something like that exists and you say, well, I'll just make one that's close because I have one kind of like it, they're likely just going to toss you right into the recycle pile because they have their form for a reason. And again, you might not agree with, well, why do they need all this information in this particular format? But it's usually based in what is their database like that they track their grant applications in. So in what order are these things entered? What are the fields that they have set up? What are the things then that they track about their applicants? What are the things that the foundation directors and trustees, what are the things that they're looking for? And if you have a pile of 10 applications and 9 of 10 use the right format and everyone can find the project title at a glance and everyone can find the project amount requested at a glance, and then here comes proposal number 10, and it might have all the same information but it did not follow the required format, well, geez, I can't find the project title. I have no idea on this front page how much they're asking. It just makes their work too hard. And you're trying to make it as easy for them as possible to understand your program and say, yes, we should fund that. So you want to do as little as you can to make it difficult in that sense. All right, 3 more top reasons here. So the proposal is poorly written and difficult to understand. And I would need to definitely explain this. You don't go, oh my gosh, what if my grammar's off? What if I have the comma in the wrong place? That's not what this means at all. Because everyone could make a grammatical error or have a misspelling, it's important to catch as many of those things as possible so that the foundation understands that you spent a significant amount of time on their proposal because it's so important to you and because it's so important to them that they fund well and that they provide the fund, they're trying to have impact here in the community. So they want to understand that you spent time, you didn't just quickly hurry it off and, oops, I forgot to run spell check. That's not what this is getting at. But if it's poorly written in the sense that they read it and they go, I don't think I understand what the goal is of this program, or, geez, how many kids are they going to try and serve? You should follow major programmatic headings. You should talk about your needs statement. You should talk about program design. You should talk about goals and objectives, evaluation, organizational capacity. You should break them into these main headings so that it's clear for the reader to follow. And there's different headings for different funders and there's lots of different ways, but if you're breaking it into the key components of the proposal so that it reads, and it's an easier read for the proposal reviewer, and they can kind of pinpoint, okay, I'm looking again over evaluation, I knew where to look for it, or geez, I need to rethink about their program design. What was that second objective? And they want to look at it. It needs to be clear for them to go through. So again, it's not necessarily just about your writing style or your grammar. That's important, but that's not all it's about. It's about how easy is it for someone to understand. One other thing to think about with that is how your organization feels about saying, making the application personal, in the sense that all about using we's, so we are applying for this versus saying the Diane Leonard organization is applying for something. It doesn't make a difference really to a foundation, but it's something to think about for what your style is and that you're consistent. So if you pick a style and start with it, you want to be consistent throughout the document. So even if you're cutting and pasting between application documents, which all of us admittedly do, you want to make sure that you're consistent and it doesn't feel like a hiccup to them every time you get to a new section. So the next reason that you get a lot of rejections is that the objectives and the plan for the proposal exceed the budget or the timelines. And so this can actually go both ways, so you might be asking for $5,000 and saying, we're going to end teen pregnancy in the county. I think everyone understands that's not realistic. For $5,000, that's not achievable. So they'd say, okay, this doesn't make sense. They don't understand the scope of what they're trying to do. On the same hand, if you were saying I want $5,000 towards a $125,000 project working to reduce teen pregnancy in the county, will that make sense? But if all you did was say, $5,000, get rid of teen pregnancy in the county, they're going to say, oh, that's not reasonable at all, especially because their mission is supposed to be close enough to yours that they're going to understand what can happen with their money or what is a realistic expectation with their money. So just you want to be careful about kind of a reality check on it. Does it seem feasible? Can you achieve it? And if you're over-promising or under-delivering, over-promising or under-promising based on what you're asking them for, they'll likely set you aside. They want a realistic plan. And then the last one is that there's insufficient evidence about becoming self-sufficient in the long run. So a lot of foundations don't like to do multi-year grants or to be an ongoing funder. That's not to say that there's tons that will do that, but a majority of them will say, oh, we don't like to be continuous year funding. Like we'll start something new or we'll expand something, we'll enhance something, but we don't want you coming back to our door every year. So what they want to hear is, what are you going to do after our money is gone? Are you working towards a cost-sharing donation program with your clients? Are you working on third-party billing because maybe what you do is a health-related service so your social workers can bill under insurance? They also don't necessarily want to hear, well, we're going to ask our individual donors for money. That might be part of your strategy for how you're going to continue it in the long run, but if the answer is as simple as that, they'll probably say, too simple of an answer and probably too unknown in terms of program continuation. The foundations like to see that what they've funded can continue. And not that there's a guarantee because, there's always hiccups and blurbs in terms of what happens with funding and programs and how they change and morph over time. So you're not guaranteeing to them, well, you funded us this year, we're going to continue this forever. But they'd like to know that you have a plan for how something you feel so strongly about now is going to be continued in a year when their funding runs out. Okay, so those are the top 6 reasons for rejection. What I'd like to talk about next is, what do you do if the grant is rejected? Now, so we talked about if the grant is awarded, that's when I usually do cartwheels, yelling, happy dance, all those things. If the grant is rejected, I usually go for a cup of coffee first, and then I decide how to proceed. So that's my personal way to deal with it. But there's really important steps to take beyond saying, oh, how do I deal with the rejection today that we feel from getting that letter saying, I'm sorry, we only funded 5% of applicants, or we only were able to fund 50%. Whatever the case may be, there's some really critical steps that you can take after you're rejected that could, in the long run, increase your competitiveness in the process, maybe next time. Maybe with this funder, maybe with a different one, but there's some really great things to do. So one is, especially if you were able to make contact with program officer, staff, or trustees in the past, to call back to the foundation and say, understand we were rejected, was wondering if, you were able to provide any feedback on our proposal, as we'd like to make some changes, if, to be more competitive in the future. So maybe they're willing to share the notes from the board of directors. There's a fair number of foundations that will. There's also a fair number of foundations that will provide informal feedback just over the phone. So by making that call, you're showing that you're still engaged in their process and that you really want to improve what you've done and continue on with your work. So that they'll take that very seriously. And you don't want to be pushy or overbearing about it. And you definitely never want to yell at a foundation and tell them that they made a mistake. True story, had it happen. It doesn't endear that organization to you. So as the fundraising professional, you're still representing that organization, and you want to treat the foundation staff like you would any individual donor, but they're there to help you. So you want to be polite, thank them for their time in reviewing it, but find out how you can improve it in the long run. And it's for the same reason. The rejection is not personal to you. It's not personal to the organization. There's usually reasons behind it, but it's not personal. It's about something that they were looking for an improvement on, an evaluation portion or the sustainability in the long run, the goals and objectives being a little different, but it's not against you. Even if you had that back and forth or some technical assistance with a program officer, it's usually not going to be personal. You shouldn't take it personally. you should send a thank you letter to foundations that have rejected you. Again, thank you for considering our proposal. The thank you letter is important, especially if you weren't able to reach out to someone over the phone, to then, via the letter, ask for feedback on the proposal. We'd really appreciate it if we could receive some feedback on the proposal so that we can improve it for the future or for the next round, or to ask in the letter or on the phone, when is your next cycle? Are we eligible to apply again? They might not go so far as, they may encourage you to apply again with the changes. They may not encourage that. It's up to you. You have to kind of gauge that conversation for, if they don't encourage you, what does that mean? Are they just, maybe they don't encourage it much, but so definitely it's an important dialogue to have happen after the grant's rejected. It just doesn't go straight to the shred file. There's definitely some work to be done that could help you in the long run for your organization. So I really should call these like Diane's grant writing rules to live by, but so these are some of the key tips that I have general grant writing wise, as well as just these kind of the perspective from the foundation side. So make sure that you're pacing yourself and that you set timelines when you're writing, because you need to meet those deadlines set by the funders. Be it the application or the report, the deadlines are key. And one of the new things to think about with the online submission piece getting added to so many foundations' application process, if there's an online submission deadline of 5 p.m. on whatever day, and you're online at 4:55 clicking submit, and their server is crashing because there's 50 other people out there clicking submit at the same time, they usually don't have a whole bunch of sympathy for people that wait to the last minute and then have a problem. It's kind of like, oh, sorry, UPS didn't deliver it. Why did you mail it this morning type thing. What you really need to do is set your deadline, especially for online things, ahead of time. Make sure you're in there 24 hours ahead of time so that you're not the victim of a server crash, and that's what kicks you out of the process. Editing is always the most critical thing that you can do. Have yourself edit. Have the key program person for the staff edit. Editing until you're just blue in the face. I always send a proposal and I'm like, oh, I should have done more. I could have read that again and reworded it differently. But part of that is what gives you the chance to have the clearest proposal so that it's easily read by the foundation staff. We talked about this again earlier, but just to reiterate how important it is to follow the funder's instructions. That's like your little guidebook for that application that says, if you want to be successful, here's how. I mean, they're telling you right up front, if you want to be successful, here's the order you need to submit it in. If you want to be successful, don't staple it. If you want to be successful, put a binder clip on it. Don't bind it. Do bind it. I mean, there's a reason that they do it, and if you choose to ignore those instructions, you're decreasing your chance for success significantly. You might just go right in the trash pile. So, and like I said, after even after you've hit submit or put the stamp on the envelope, you'll always feel like there's more you could have done. The good news is we've talked about some of these tips here for things that you can do after you've already hit submit, because there are some important things you can still do. So hopefully those are some tips that would let you improve your communication with the foundation staff. A few last tips here. You don't want to be obvious in your use of boilerplates. Now, I encourage boilerplates for my clients in the sense that if you don't want to necessarily just be responding to RFPs all the time, bouncing between RFPs that have been released, but rather you want to be thoughtful about picking a program that needs funding support, identifying what your plan is, and then finding a funder. So to me, that's what a boilerplate is. But if you are using a letter that's been written for a program, and you have the little section that says, Dear Name, and it's highlighted, and you've got the address block, and then you've got your lines, and everything's the same except for at the end, we would greatly appreciate $10,000 from the Diane Leonard Foundation. And that's it. And so all that you customize is the address, the to line, and that line at the end that says the foundation line in your request. Got to be honest, the foundation staff can tell. They're like, it makes no connection to our mission. You can tell that it looks like this form letter. Just the same way you can tell when you get junk mail in your email or your snail mail, you can tell when it's form or it's junk. So can the foundations, and it doesn't make them feel warm and fuzzy. Instead, they're like, geez, well, they didn't take the time to really write to us. They just kind of gave us a can letter, and that was the request. It's not going to feel sincere to them, and it's not going to score you well. So that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind about how to customize to show the foundation that you understand, even if what you change. So you have a generic letter, it talks about the program, you change your address, you change your request at the bottom, but now in each one you've customized a paragraph that talks about why their partnership is important, why your mission matches their mission. If the rest of the letter is the same, that's okay, but you've now shown them that you've paid attention to who they are, to why they're funding what they're funding, and why you think that it's a match. So it's really a key way, because otherwise, they can see right through it. So we said mass requests are easy to spot. And the other thing is that you really, as you're trying to build these relationships with foundation staff, to reach out to them to get technical assistance, you want to be sincere in your foundation relationship development. It's just like donor relations. You wouldn't want to be insincere or seem fake to a major donor or an individual donor or a sponsor for an event. Your foundation staff are just as important to be sincere with, to be really to have a nice relationship with, and to be grateful then when they do give you the time. So, with that said, I guess I'd like to open it up one last time to see if there were any more questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Okay, we're now unmuted. Any questions before we dismiss for the day? Diane, would you be available to any of our participants if they have a question after the session is over and it pops into their head? Would you be all right if they contacted you and about a question like that?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. All right. I'm gonna. If nobody has a question, I'm going to mute it one more time, and then we'll dismiss. Give me 1 minute.
The conference has been muted.
Okay. Well, once again, this is Stephen Mill at Charity Channel, and I want to thank all of our participants in today's Charity University webinar session for signing up for today's session and actively participating, those of you who were able to. We appreciate that. Do keep an eye out both through the Charity Channel site and the Grant Professionals Association site at grantprofessionals.org for upcoming grant-related classes. We have quite a number of them scheduled over the next few weeks and months, and we're really excited about them. Also, if you're a member of Charity Channel, you will be receiving notice by email as these classes are added as well, so that's helpful. I want to also in particular thank Diane for preparing today's 90-minute session. To teach for 90 minutes, particularly when you can't see the other person, is always a challenge, and my hat always goes off to our presenters for stepping up and helping all of us learn to do our crafts better by teaching these sessions. So, Diane, thank you so much for that. Not only that, you managed to get through 90 minutes, and I don't think you took a swig of water that I heard. Or you did it really, really well. And in any case, it's a bit of a marathon, and I just want to thank you for doing that. And I understand you have some more that you will be presenting for Charity University in the next few weeks or so. Do you want to tell us briefly what they are? Sure.
I have 3 more coming up. I'm doing one each month. And so on September the 10th, these are all at Fridays, I'll be doing an overview of grant writing, so really getting the basics of the actual proposal itself. And then on Friday, October 8th, I'll be doing more of an advanced grant writing class that delves into the specific parts of the presentation. And the last one will be November 12th, and that'll be a webinar based on proposal budgeting for grants.
Oh, terrific. Well, we're looking forward to those sessions as well. Okay, to everybody, I want to wish you all a really great afternoon. It is Friday. It's time to let your hair down and maybe sneak out early if you have that luxury. In any case, have a great rest of the day and weekend, everybody, and thanks again for participating today.